The Nova Helios trading outpost hung like a tarnished coin at the edge of the galaxy, its docking ports cluttered with vessels of every imaginable origin. Among the sprawling market stalls and repair facilities, Murphy's Repairs stood as perhaps the most modest establishment, a converted cargo bay with a flickering holographic sign that occasionally misspelled its own name. Inside the workshop, 20-year-old Astrid Murphy wiped sweat from her brow as she finished recalibrating an ancient flux compressor. Her calloused fingers moved with the practiced precision of someone who had spent their entire life handling tools. She possessed an innate talent for machinery, a gift inherited from her late father, who had built this place from nothing. "Perfect," she murmured, listening to the gentle hum of the restored device. Astrid didn't rely on diagnostic computers like most technicians. She could hear when something wasn't right, feeling the subtle vibrations through her fingertips that told her more than any readout ever could. "Astrid!" her mother's voice called from the front counter. "We've got a situation." Elenina Murphy managed the business side of their small repair shop, where Astrid had inherited her father's mechanical aptitude. From her mother, she'd gained an unshakable practicality. Elenina stood at the counter, her expression tight with concern as she faced what appeared to be a delegation of aliens. At the center stood a tall, imposing figure that Astrid recognized immediately from interstellar broadcasts. Zortal, the century billionaire who controlled the largest privately owned fleet in 3 sectors. His iridescent skin shimmered with suppressed agitation, 6-fingered hands tapping impatiently against the counter's worn surface. "Gio, this is my daughter, Astrid," Elenina said carefully. "Our chief engineer." Zortal's compound eyes swiveled to take in Astrid's oil-stained overalls and the outdated tools hanging from her belt. His mouth parts twitched in what she recognized as the century equivalent of a dismissive sneer. "This child?" he said, his universal translator rendering his words in crisp, condescending standard. "This is who you offer to repair my vessel." Behind him, a cadre of sleek century assistants exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from amusement to outright disdain. "What seems to be the problem with your ship, sir?" Astrid asked, maintaining professionalism despite the insult. Zortal gestured toward the viewport, where an elegant vessel hovered in the docking bay. Even from this distance, Astrid could appreciate its beauty, sleek black lines accented with pulsing blue energy conduits. The Obsidian Seraph was famous throughout the galaxy, a custom-built marvel of engineering that had won numerous competitions for both speed and style. The anti-gravity frame system is malfunctioning, and the quantum core is experiencing fluctuations that my engineers cannot explain, Zortal said. "We visited 3 stations before this. Outpost. No one has been able to resolve the issue." "We'd be happy to take a look," Elenina began, but Zortal raised a hand to silence her. "Let me be clear," he said, addressing Astrid directly now. "I don't believe you can fix it. Your primitive equipment and—" He gestured at the entirety of the workshop. "Limited resources seem woefully inadequate. However, I find myself without options until my corporate team arrives in 3 days." His eyes narrowed, and Astrid felt a challenge forming. "How about a wager, human? If you cannot repair the Obsidian Seraph within 48 hours, you will publicly acknowledge the superiority of Century engineering and the limitations of your species' capabilities." Astrid stiffened. "And if I succeed?" Zortal's mouthparts curved into what might have been a smile. "Then I shall pay you 10 times your standard rate and acknowledge your skill publicly on the interplanetary network." Elenina stepped forward. "Astrid, a word." But Astrid had already extended her hand in the human gesture of agreement. "Deal," Zortal looked at her hand with mild distaste before briefly touching it with his own. Excellent. My assistants will monitor your progress. I expect regular updates. As the Century delegation departed, Elelina turned to her daughter with exasperation. Have you lost your mind? That's Zortal. He owns half the shipping lanes in this sector. If you fail, we could lose everything. Our reputation. I won't fail, Astrid said, already gathering her tools. Dad wouldn't have backed down, and neither will I. Elelina's expression softened. Your father was the best mechanic I ever knew, but even he would approach this with caution. I know what I'm doing, Mom. Astrid slung her toolkit over her shoulder. Besides, did you see that ship? When am I ever going to get another chance to work on something like the Obsidian Seraph? Within the hour. Astrid stood before the magnificent vessel, trying not to appear overwhelmed by its complexity. A ramp descended, and one of Zortal's assistants, a younger Century with lighter coloration, gestured for her to follow. I am Raxiven, Senior Technical Advisor. He introduced himself. I will observe your work and report to Master Zortal. The interior of the ship was even more impressive than its exterior, polished surfaces inlaid with living circuitry, atmospheric controllers that adjusted automatically to Astrid's breathing patterns, and gravity plates that felt more like walking on perfectly balanced clouds than metal flooring. The main engine room, Raxiven announced as a doorway spiraled open. Astrid's breath caught. The quantum core pulsed with controlled energy, its crystalline structure housed in a containment field that shimmered with mathematical precision. Around it, the anti-gravity frame system, an intricate network of repulsion nodes, formed a three-dimensional lattice that should have been in perfect balance. But Astrid could see immediately that something was wrong. The core's pulsations weren't consistent. There was a barely perceptible flutter every 17th beat. How long has it been doing that? She asked, pointing to the quantum core. Raxiven looked impressed despite himself. You noticed already. 3 weeks. 2 days. It began after we traversed the Nix Nebula. Astrid approached the control console, noticing how the Sentry assistants tensed as her human fingers hovered over their technology. May I? Raxiven nodded reluctantly. Instead of using the console, Astrid closed her eyes and placed her palm against the metal housing of the quantum core's chamber. Her father had always taught her to listen to machines first, to feel their rhythms and understand their language. You're not using the diagnostics, another assistant observed with obvious disdain. Not yet, Astrid murmured, concentrating on the subtle vibrations transferring through the metal. There was a pattern to the irregularity, not random, but definitely not normal. Opening her eyes, she moved to examine the anti-gravity frame. The problem had to be connected. The quantum fluctuations were affecting the gravitational balance. But which had caused which? I need to see the shield matrix for the oscillation regulator crystal, she said, turning to Raxiven. The Century exchanged glances. That's a tertiary system. Our diagnostics show no issues there. Please, Astrid insisted. I need to check everything. Reluctantly, Raxiven activated a hidden panel, revealing a complex array of crystalline nodes connected by filaments thinner than human hair. Astrid leaned close, using her father's old magnification goggles, outdated but reliable. There, she whispered, more to herself than her observers. A microscopic aberration in one of the protective mesh screens around the regulator crystal, barely visible even with magnification. I need to adjust the mesh, she said, reaching for her toolkit. Impossible, Raxiven stated flatly. The mesh is calibrated to Century precision. Human hands are too imprecise. Astrid bit back a retort. Then I'll need to use your calibration tools. Our calibration requires sensory neural links. Another assistant interjected smugly. Unless you've grown connection nodules recently. Astrid took a deep breath. Fine, I'll use my own methods. Before they could object, she pulled out a small, handcrafted device from her toolkit, one of her father's inventions that combined old-world precision with intuitive design. What is that primitive thing? Raxaven asked, genuinely curious. An analog frequency tuner, Astrid explained, carefully positioning it near the mesh. Sometimes older technology sees things newer systems miss. For the next several hours, Astrid worked methodically, carefully documenting each observation, while the Sentry assistants watched with increasing interest. The mesh adjustment helped stabilize the regulator crystal, but didn't fully resolve the fluctuations. There was something else, something deeper. As the station's artificial day cycle dimmed to night, Zortal himself arrived to check on her progress. "Well?" he demanded. Towering over her crouched form, Astrid straightened, fighting exhaustion. The protective mesh around your oscillation regulator crystal was misaligned, causing harmonic disturbances in the quantum field. I've adjusted it, but there's a secondary issue I'm still tracking down. Zortal's expression remained unimpressed. You've used nearly half your allotted time to fix a minor calibration issue? Perhaps I overestimated even your limited capabilities. As he turned to leave, the ship suddenly shuddered, a brief but violent tremor that sent diagnostic warnings flashing across every console. "What did you do?" Raxaven demanded, pushing Astrid aside to check the readings. "Nothing. That's what I've been trying to tell you. There's another problem. Something intermittent." Zortal whirled back. "Fix it, now, or our wager is concluded early." After he departed, Astrid slumped against the console. The pressure was mounting, and she still hadn't identified the root cause. Worse, the tremor had disrupted the navigation systems, adding another layer of complexity to the repairs. "You should rest." Elelenina's voice came through Astrid's communicator. "You've been at it for 12 hours straight." "I can't. Mom, every time I think I'm getting close, something else goes wrong. It's like the ship is fighting me." "Remember what your father used to say about stubborn machines?" Astrid smiled despite her fatigue. "They're not being difficult. They're trying to tell you something you're not listening for." "Exactly. Get some sleep. Listen with fresh ears tomorrow." Reluctantly, Astrid returned to their modest quarters aboard Nova Helios. Sleep came fitfully, her dreams filled with quantum fluctuations and the judgmental compound eyes of Sentry assistants. She awoke before the station's day cycle began, a realization crystallizing in her mind. Rushing back to the Obsidian Seraph, she found Raxaven already there, monitoring the night's diagnostic logs. "The tremors increased in frequency," he reported, his professional demeanor slightly shaken. "Master Zortal is displeased." "I need to see the regulator crystal directly," Astrid said, already moving toward the protected chamber. "That's impossible. The radiation—" "I know the risks, but I think I know what's happening." After much argument and a direct appeal to Zortal via communicator, Astrid received reluctant permission to examine the crystal, with appropriate protective measures. Suited up in radiation gear that had clearly not been designed for human proportions, she entered the sealed chamber. The crystal hung suspended in its own gravitational pocket, pulsing with the ship's heartbeat. Using her father's old sensor wand, another analog device that the Sentry had scoffed at, she carefully scanned the crystal's surface. "There!" she exclaimed, the word muffled through her helmet. A hairline fracture, nearly invisible, ran along one facet of the crystal. More importantly, There was a trace of unusual plasma residue trapped within the fissure, something that wouldn't register on standard scans, but was causing minute disruptions in the crystal's resonance. The realization of what had happened struck her all at once. "The Nix Nebula," she muttered. "You picked up a plasma contaminant when you passed through. It created a microfracture that's been growing ever since." Working quickly, she calibrated her father's frequency tuner to the exact resonance needed to neutralize the contamination. It was delicate work. One miscalculation could shatter the crystal entirely. "What is she doing?" she heard Zortal demand through the chamber's communication system. "Some kind of primitive frequency modulation," Raxiven replied, his tone uncertain. Astrid blocked out their voices, focusing entirely on the crystal. Slowly, methodically, she adjusted the tuner until the trapped plasma began to respond, vibrating at precisely the frequency needed to break it down into harmless components. Hours passed. Her arms ached from holding the tuner in exactly the right position. Sweat pooled uncomfortably inside her ill-fitting suit. But finally, the plasma residue dissipated, leaving only the fracture to deal with. "I need a replacement crystal," she announced, exiting the chamber on wobbly legs. Zortal, who had apparently been watching the entire time, laughed mirthlessly. "Impossible. That crystal was custom-grown on Arcturus Prime. There isn't another like it within 50 parsecs." Astrid removed her helmet, meeting his gaze steadily. "I don't need an exact match. I need a crystal with compatible resonance properties that I can adapt." "Such as?" Zortal challenged. "There's an old T-class shuttle in our workshop. It has a similar, though much smaller, regulator crystal. With the right modifications, I can make it work." The Sentry assistants erupted in protests, but Zortal silenced them with a gesture. "You would replace my custom Arcturian crystal with a salvaged part from human garbage?" "Yes," Astrid said simply, "because it will work." A tense silence followed, broken only by the increasingly erratic hum of the damaged crystal. "Very well," Zortal finally conceded. "But when this fails, and it will, you'll have only yourself to blame." The remaining hours became a blur of activity. Elelenina delivered the crystal from the old shuttle, and Astrid set to work modifying it to match the resonance patterns of the original. The Sentry assistants, originally hostile, gradually began asking questions, some even offering suggestions that bridged their advanced knowledge with her unconventional approach. As the 48-hour deadline approached, Astrid made her final adjustments. The replacement crystal, smaller but reinforced with a lattice framework of her own design, now sat where the Arcturian original had been. She had recalibrated the entire system to accommodate the different properties, making adjustments that even surprised the Sentry engineers. "It's time," Raxiven announced. As Zortal entered the engine room for the final test, the billionaire looked at the modified crystal with undisguised skepticism. "This improvisation is your solution?" Astrid stepped back from the console, exhausted but confident. "Yes, everything's ready for startup." Zortal approached the main control interface, his six-fingered hand hovering over the activation sequence. "You understand that if this fails, the reputation of your little shop dies today." "It won't fail." With a final, dismissive glance, Zortal initiated the startup sequence. The engine room fell silent as everyone watched the crystal. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the crystal began to glow, first faintly, then with increasing brilliance. The quantum core responded, its pulsations perfectly synchronized with the new regulator. The anti-gravity frame hummed back to life, each node activating in perfect sequence. On the main display, performance metrics began to appear, all of them steadily climbing past their previous benchmarks. "Impossible," one of the assistants whispered. Zortal stared at the readings, then at the humming crystal, then finally at Astrid. For perhaps the first time in his long life, the Century Billionaire seemed at a loss for words. The ship's AI broke the silence. All systems functional. Performance parameters exceeding factory specifications by 12%. 12%. Astrid fought to keep the smile from her face. She hadn't just fixed the ship, she'd improved it. Zortal's compound eyes blinked rapidly, a sign of intense emotional processing among his species. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its condescending edge. "It appears," he said carefully, "that I have lost our wager." News of Astrid's success spread quickly through Nova Helios. By the time she and Zortal emerged from the Obsidian Seraph, a small crowd had gathered, traders, mechanics, and station personnel eager to witness the outcome of the unlikely challenge. Standing before them, Zortal's towering form seemed somewhat diminished, though his posture remained proud. From a concealed pocket, he produced a golden credit chip, a denomination rarely seen in this part of the galaxy. "As agreed," he said, extending it toward Astrid. 10 times your standard rate. Additionally, he hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what came next. "I acknowledge publicly that your skills exceeded my expectations and demonstrate the value of your species' approach to engineering." The gathered crowd murmured in appreciation. For a century of Zortal's status to make such an admission was unprecedented. Astrid looked at the golden chip, enough credits to upgrade their entire workshop with the latest equipment, perhaps even expand to a larger facility. Then she looked at her mother, who stood watching with proud tears in her eyes. "I have a counteroffer," Astrid said, surprising everyone, especially Zortal. "Instead of this payment, I propose you establish a scholarship fund for young mechanics here on Nova Helios, and provide Murphy's Repairs with enough equipment to serve as a proper training facility." Zortal's mouth parts twitched in what might have been confusion. "You would reject personal gain for community benefit? The next time your ship needs repairs, wouldn't you prefer more qualified technicians in this sector?" Astrid countered. For the second time that day, Zortal found himself speechless. Finally, he inclined his head in a gesture of respect. "Your proposal is logical. I shall arrange for the necessary equipment and establish the fund." He paused, studying her with new interest. "Perhaps there is more to learn from your methods than I had considered." 1 month later, Murphy's Repairs had been transformed. New equipment, a careful blend of advanced technology and traditional tools, filled the expanded workshop. More importantly, young apprentices from all corners of Nova Helios now filled the space, eager to learn from Astrid and Elelanina. "Your father would be so proud," Elelanina said, watching Astrid guide a young Tralaxian through the basics of resonance tuning. "I still use his tools," Astrid replied, patting the weathered toolkit at her hip. "Some problems need the latest tech, but others need someone who can listen to what the machine is trying to tell them." Elelanina finished with a smile. A notification chimed from the front desk. Another job request. This time from a Century diplomatic vessel reporting unusual fluctuations in their navigation system. "Shall I tell them our chief engineer will take a look?" Elelanina asked with a wink. Astrid grinned, already reaching for her toolkit. "Tell them I'm looking forward to it." As she prepared for the new challenge, Astrid caught sight of herself reflected in a polished panel, no longer just the mechanic's daughter, but a bridge between worlds, between traditions and innovations. all because she had dared to listen when others had only looked. On the far side of the galaxy, aboard the Obsidian Seraph, Zortal reviewed the performance logs of his prized vessel. 12.3% improvement now. The humans' modifications had somehow continued to optimize themselves over time. "Set course for Nova Helios," he instructed his pilot, his compound eyes reflecting the starlight. "I believe we may have more to learn there than I initially thought." Behind him, Raxiven smiled slightly. He had already begun incorporating some of Astrid's methods into his own work, with remarkable results. Perhaps there was something to this human approach after all. As the Obsidian Seraph accelerated to faster-than-light speeds, its modified crystal heart sang a perfect harmony of old and new technologies, a testament to what could be achieved when different worlds and different methods came together. It was the beginning of a new era of cooperation, all because a mechanic's daughter had refused to back down from an impossible challenge,